London, England. The Marquee Club, Wardour Street, Soho. November 14th, 1966. A Monday evening, which should have meant nothing. Monday nights at the Marquee were not events, they were fillers, warm-up slots for acts that hadn't earned the weekend yet, sessions for musicians still proving they deserved to exist in a city that had decided, sometime around 1964, that it was the center of the musical universe. The air inside the Marquee smelled like cigarette smoke, spilled beer, and the particular kind of damp that settles into brick walls when 150 people pack themselves into a space intended for considerably fewer. The stage was small. It was always small at the Marquee. A raised wooden platform barely large enough for a four-piece band, bathed in lighting that oscillated between too bright and completely wrong. But small stages had launched enormous careers from this address, and everyone who walked through that door knew it. Tonight the crowd was different from the usual Monday assembly. Word had spread, as word always spread in the tight circles of London's music underground, that something unusual was happening. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had been playing around London for 6 weeks, accumulating a reputation that traveled faster than any press release. Musicians were talking. Not to journalists, not publicly, just to each other, in the language of people who understand what they're hearing and haven't yet decided how they feel about it. Jimi Hendrix, 23 years old, born in Seattle, Washington, a black American guitarist who had spent years on the road in the American South playing backup for acts whose names you knew, but whose treatment of their musicians you would prefer not to know. He had played behind Little Richard, behind the Isley Brothers, behind acts that used sidemen like furniture and discarded them with equal ceremony. He had been fired from more bands than most musicians ever joined. Too loud, too flamboyant, too much. That was the recurring verdict from people in positions of authority over him. You are too much for this space. Know your place. Play behind the singer. Disappear. He had arrived in London on September 23, 1966, brought over by Chas Chandler, the former Animals bassist who had seen him play a small New York club and immediately understood he was witnessing something that didn't fit any existing category. Chandler brought him to London because London was where the audience existed that might have ears large enough to receive what Hendrix was carrying. He assembled a band around him, Noel Redding on bass, Mitch Mitchell on drums, 2 British musicians who had enough technical skill and enough open-mindedness to accommodate whatever Hendrix decided to do on any given night, which could change without warning between the first chord and the last. In these 6 weeks of London shows, the Experience had developed a local mythology. Musicians who'd seen them play refused to describe it in ordinary terms. They used words like impossible and illegal. They described Hendrix doing things with a guitar that the guitar was not supposed to permit, playing behind his back, with his teeth, controlling feedback the way a sculptor controls clay, using it as a compositional element rather than an accident to be avoided, generating sounds from a standard Fender Stratocaster that no one who understood the instrument's mechanics could fully explain. But reputation is not universal. And on this particular Monday evening, not everyone in the Marquee was a believer. In a booth near the back of the venue, separated from the stage by the full depth of the room and several layers of British skepticism, sat a group of established musicians, men who had earned their status through years of work, through hit records, through successful tours, through the slow accumulation of credibility in a world that granted it reluctantly. They had a right to their positions. They had worked for them. But the thing about earned position is that it sometimes produces in its holders a certainty that new things must audition for their approval rather than the reverse. The most prominent voice among them belonged to a guitarist whose name you would recognize, a man who had spent a decade becoming one of the most respected instrumentalists in British rock, who had played on recordings that defined a generation, whose technique was clean and precise and celebrated in exactly the terms that the music press of 1966 understood how to celebrate. He had been told about Hendrix. He had declined, more than once, invitations to see him play. He was here tonight for unrelated reasons, to discuss a potential collaboration with another musician at the venue. And the news that Hendrix was on the bill had not changed his posture or his expression. This American, he said to his colleagues, louder than the ambient conversation strictly required, because London clubs in 1966 had a particular acoustic quality that carried voices they were not intended to carry. This American they're all talking about. You know what he is? He's a novelty act, a circus. He sets his guitar on fire. He plays it with his teeth. That's not musicianship. That's vaudeville. I've heard the recordings. There's nothing there that a proper guitarist can't do with both eyes closed. He doesn't belong on a stage like this. He belongs in a sideshow. The table around him laughed, the kind of laugh that seals agreement without requiring anyone to commit to the opinion individually. The comment traveled. Clubs are not as loud as people outside them assume. The sections near the stage had heard variations of it. Musicians standing near the bar had caught enough of it to reconstruct the rest. And someone, whose identity was never confirmed but whose face was seen moving quickly from the back of the room toward the stage area, relayed the essential content to a member of the experience. Hendrix was standing backstage, which at the Marquee meant standing in a corridor barely wide enough for a person and a guitar case. He was wearing a purple satin shirt with ruffles at the cuffs, an embroidered jacket that he had found in a second-hand shop on Portobello Road 2 weeks earlier, and trousers so tight they seemed to have been applied rather than worn. His hair rose from his head in a natural that was still sufficiently unusual in London in 1966 to attract commentary everywhere he went. He held his Stratocaster by the neck with the casual grip of someone holding a familiar hand. He listened to the account of what had been said. The person telling him watched his face carefully for the reaction. There was no anger. There was no hurt. There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone is measuring a distance, not with their eyes but with something internal and more precise. Then Hendrix looked down at the guitar in his hand, looked up at the stage. His expression was not readable in any conventional sense, but the person who told the story for decades afterward described it as the face of someone who had just been given permission to do something they had been waiting years to do. He walked onto the stage. The opening moment of any Hendrix performance in this period had a specific quality that was difficult to articulate and impossible to mistake. It was the quality of a room becoming aware of itself, of an audience that had been talking to itself suddenly encountering something that required its full attention. It happened before a note was played. It happened in the moment Hendrix positioned himself at the microphone, in the way he placed his feet, in the specific angle of his body relative to the guitar, in the fact that he seemed to be entirely somewhere else while simultaneously being completely present. Mitch Mitchell settled behind the drums. Noel Redding adjusted his bass strap. The crowd in the front sections pressed forward with the unconscious movement of people gravitating toward something without being able to explain why. And then, Hendrix began. What came in the first 60 seconds has been described by everyone present in ways that are consistent in their emotional content and almost completely inconsistent in their technical specifics. Some said he opened with a chord that sounded like it contained 12 notes simultaneously. Some said he went immediately into feedback that he controlled with the precision of a conductor's baton. Some said the first thing he did was bend a single note so slowly and so far that by the time it resolved, it felt like a sentence had been completed. A question asked and answered in the span of 2 seconds. What all descriptions agree on is the sound, not the notes, not the technique. The sound. The specific character of what came out of the amplifiers in those first moments, which was unlike anything the Marquee's walls had previously been asked to contain. It was a sound that seemed to have physical dimension, that occupied space in the room the way another person would occupy space, that displaced air and altered the atmosphere, and made several people near the stage take an involuntary step backward, as if something had arrived that required more room. The man in the back booth stopped talking. It happened on perhaps the 3rd or 4th bar, at a precise moment that none of his companions would have been able to identify afterward, because they were not tracking time anymore. They were simply present in the room in a way that had not been the case 30 seconds earlier. He set down his drink. Not deliberately. The drink simply ceased to be relevant. Hendrix played for 12 minutes without stopping. In those 12 minutes, documented by 2 people in the audience who had brought reel-to-reel recording equipment despite the venue's official prohibition against recording devices, he moved through musical territory that existed outside the categories available in 1966. He played blues the way a man plays blues who has absorbed every form of it at the cellular level, not as a genre or a technique, but as a language with its own grammar and its own capacity for complexity. He played over the blues the way a river plays over its own bed, following the same course while constantly changing its relationship to that course. He used feedback as counterpoint. He used silence as architecture. He bent strings to pitches that existed between the conventional notes and somehow made them the right pitches for the specific moment in the specific phrase. He did things with his right hand that made musicians in the audience look at their own right hands with a new and slightly unsettling awareness of what hands were capable of. At the 3-minute mark, a guitarist who had been standing near the left side of the stage leaned to his companion and said something that was later reported as, "That's not something you can practice. That's something you either have or you don't." His companion didn't respond because he was no longer capable of the processing required for response. At 7 minutes, something in the room changed. It had been changing incrementally, but at approximately 7 minutes into the performance, the change became visible and collective. People who had been standing at the back began moving toward the stage, not with the aggressive push of people trying to improve their position, but with the slow, involuntary drift of people following a gravitational pull they hadn't been consulted about. The conversations that had been running in parallel to the music, the standard background noise of a club that has not yet been fully arrested by what's on stage, went silent completely. The room became a single thing. Hendrix reached the solo 3 minutes from the end. What came before, it had been extraordinary. What came in the solo was something else, something that existed in a different register of experience, something for which extraordinary is an inadequate word in the way that saying a hurricane is windy is technically accurate and entirely insufficient. He climbed the neck of the guitar to a place where the notes grew thin and intense, like wire under tension, and held at a pitch that seemed to exist past the instrument's natural limits. Then he bent down from it, slowly, impossibly slowly for a single sustained note, bending the pitch down the way you would lower something irreplaceable into the ground, with the full awareness of what the gesture means, until the note resolved into a chord that detonated in the chest of every person in the room simultaneously. Several people reported physical responses they had never previously associated with music. A woman standing 3 rows from the stage said afterward that she had not realized she was crying until the solo ended and she touched her face. A music journalist who had covered hundreds of performances over 12 years and prided himself on professional distance wrote in his notebook, not his published review but the actual notebook, 2 words: completely undone. A musician who had been playing professionally for 8 years stood with his guitar pick between his fingers, the pick he had been holding when the performance started, and when the show ended, he had no memory of the previous 12 minutes, and the pick had left a mark in his palm from being held so tightly without his awareness. The man in the back booth stood up before the performance was over. Not to leave, to see. He had moved from his seated position at some point during the solo without noticing the transition from sitting to standing, which is not the normal mechanics of human movement. He was standing when the final chord rang through the room and hung there in the marquee air, sustained by the natural resonance of the space, diminishing so gradually that no one could have identified the exact moment it ended. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room that is not quiet, but has had all its usual sound evacuated, the kind of silence that means the opposite of silence. Then the crowd responded in the way crowds respond when they have witnessed something that falls outside the category of performance, when they have been present for something that reclassified itself in real time from entertainment into event. Hendrix stood at the microphone. He was not performing gratitude. He was not performing anything. He simply stood with the guitar, his face carrying the same unreadable expression it had carried in the corridor 20 minutes earlier, and nodded once at the audience in a gesture that acknowledged what had passed between them and required nothing further. Backstage, in the corridor, he sat on a guitar case and lit a cigarette. Chaz Chandler sat beside him. Nothing was said for a long time of the kind that doesn't need measuring in minutes because it's being measured in something else. Eventually Hendrix exhaled, looked at the ceiling, and said the only thing he said about the evening that was ever repeated. He said, "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just playing." The man from the back booth found Chaz Chandler later in the evening. The conversation was private, short, and was described by Chandler in interviews over the following years in consistent terms. The man said, "I was wrong about him. I want to be clear that I was wrong. Whatever I said earlier this evening was the opinion of someone who hadn't heard what I just heard, and I withdrew it in the moment of the first solo, and everything that follows from the retraction follows from that." He never said this publicly. In the music press of 1966 and for years after, his own status remained unchanged, his reputation intact, his opinions continued to be sought and published. But people who were in the room that night carried the knowledge of what he had said in private, and it passed from person to person in the particular way that important truths pass through communities that understand their value. Hendrix did not discuss the incident. When reporters in the weeks that followed wrote about the growing phenomenon of the Jimi Hendrix experience, when they asked about the accelerating reputation, about the musicians who were being cited as converted, he declined to frame it in terms of victory or vindication. He did not use the language of combat. He used the language of music. "There was something I was trying to reach in the playing tonight," he said in one of the few quoted responses from this period. "I don't always reach it. Tonight I was close. Close." The word carries its own precision. A man who had been told he was too much, too loud, too flamboyant, who had been handed the title of sideshow by a voice from the established order, stood 12 feet from that voice, and in 12 minutes demonstrated that the categories used to dismiss him were not categories at all. They were simply the limits of what the person holding them had been willing to imagine. The Marquee Show was not the moment the world discovered Jimi Hendrix. There would be the Monterey Pop Festival the following year. The explosion, the global recognition, the cultural realignment that happens when something genuinely new arrives without warning in the center of what everyone thought was already complete. There would be recordings that sold in numbers that made the economics of music briefly irrelevant as a measurement of what it contained. There would be stage performances that became reference points, events held inside the culture's memory as evidence of what music could do when played without any limitation imposed from outside. But the people who were in the marquee on that Monday night in November 1966, the musicians who had pressed toward the stage, the journalist with his 2 words in his notebook, the man who had stood up from his booth in the middle of a solo he had not expected to hear, those people carried something different from what the wider world would eventually carry. They carried the knowledge of what it had looked like before the world knew what to call it. They carried the specific memory of being in a room when a man responded to being told he didn't belong there, by belonging there so completely that the very concept of belonging was restructured in real time. The guitar can speak in ways that have no verbal equivalent. This is not metaphor. It is the technical fact that the human nervous system receives certain combinations of frequency and timing through channels that exist below language, that activate responses language cannot trigger and cannot describe once triggered. Hendrix understood this not as theory but as practice. He had understood it from the first time he held an instrument. A single-string guitar he had constructed from a broom and a rubber band when he was 11 years old in Seattle, before anyone had told him he would be too much for any stage. He was not too much. The stages were too small. But he played them anyway, because the music was not waiting for the stages to grow. The music was already there, already complete, in the hands of a young man from Seattle who had spent years being told he existed at the margins of the thing he had never been at the margins of, who had only ever been at the center of it, who demonstrated this on a Monday evening in a small club in Soho to 150 witnesses who spent the rest of their lives carrying the weight and the privilege of having been present. The legend does not require documentation. The legend is not the recording, though recordings exist. The legend is not the reviews, though reviews were written. The legend is what happened in the room between the first chord and the last. In the silence that followed, in the moment a man who had been told he didn't belong stood exactly where he belonged and simply played.